Hi again, it's Amelia. So we're ready for After Effects. In this video I'm just going to show really simple keyframing and just creating that three-layered parallax where the foreground, midground and background move to create a depth of field. To get started, here's a little introduction to the space. So like most Adobe software, we've got our top menu bar with various different effects and options available to us there. And then we've got our toolbar straight beneath that. We've got a project panel where all the files that we will import will sit in here, and beneath that is our layers panel. And our layers panel has a timeline adjoined to it where each layer will have its own individual timeline, and that's why we separated everything off. In the center here is our footage panel, and on the far right is our info preview, audios and other effects too. So let's begin with importing that file we made earlier. So import file. So same with your Adobe Illustrator file as your Photoshop files. All are acceptable. However, when you go import as, change footage to composition retain layer sizes, because footage will flatten everything off and we want to have access to those layers we separated. Hit open, and I'm just going to double check editable layer styles with composition retain layer sizes. Great. So in our project folder, we've got a folder with all of the individual layers to this project, and we've also got a pre-made composition file, and this file is exactly the same as that which we had in Photoshop. So if we double click that, we will open up all of the layers we had there. So let's do a tiny bit of housekeeping before we start animating. I'm just going to check the composition settings. So here where it says animation parallax, I'm going to open up the pre-flight menu and go into its composition settings. It's got the pixel dimensions which I picked back in Photoshop. I've put the frame rate to 25 for animation. And as for duration, which works in hours, minutes, seconds and milliseconds, I've picked 5 seconds. I've left the background colour black because I've got my own in. Okay, so next thing, this very top layer and this very back layer, we don't really need in our layers panel, or we don't need to see them because I'm not animating them. First, I'm going to rename them by hitting enter. I've got a filter and a sky. So you can see those two layers I'm about to hide off. Now I want them visible, so I'm keeping the eye on. However, I want to get them out of my layers panel because this panel gets very busy very quickly. So there's this little guy behind a line. I'm just going to select him to hide him off, and same with sky, I'm going to select him to hide him off. And then in my layers panel, I've got a shy guy feature which hides all layers. So if I select him, I can hide off those two layers without disrupting anything in this lovely footage panel. So with that bit of housekeeping done, I'm going to keep the layers that I am going to be animating. Background, there we go, just get them all named. And the next thing I'm going to do before I start animating is making sure my sheep follows my midground. So at the moment, if I pick up my midground in my footage panel, my sheep stays stationary. So I'm going to do something called a parent or a link between two layers. Now I want the midground to be the main parent, so I want the sheep to follow however I animate the midground. So I'm going to select the sheep layer, and here in my layers panel I've got a parent and link system. If you can't see that, on the very bottom far left corner there's a expand and collapse switches which might be just hiding some features for you. So where the parent and link system is, where it says none, I'm going to drop down that menu and tell the sheep to follow the midground. So now when I pick up midground, that sheep is following. However, I can still animate sheep completely separately and individually because it's still its own layer. Great. So let's set our first keyframes. I'm going to work with the foreground first, and to find any of the transforms to animate with, I'm going to use the drop-down menu and the drop-down menu of transform to find a selection of transforms that I can begin to animate with. I'm just going to work with position today and just basically look at keyframing on a whole. So to start off any animating, I'm going to make sure my time slider is at the very beginning. I'm going to select the stopwatch, which places the first keyframe. And the two values you can see here are the pixel positioning of my anchor point of that layer. So that's this round circle here. So that keyframe has that information. So I'm going to move the slider, and at the very end of the animation, at the end of the 5 seconds, I want this layer to have moved across the screen to this end. Now we can immediately see a motion path happen on our footage panel. In our motion path, we've got two circular handles here. Now those two handles are our Bezier curve handles. You might recognize them from Illustrator. What I mean by that is if I pull at them, I can change my linear straight motion path into one that has a wobble. Now I'm selecting play by just hitting the space bar. However, I don't want a wobble, I just want a straight line movement. Now if I take that time slider to the beginning and hit the space bar, you can see that layer moves from A to B. So, really simple keyframe editing. I can pull and move these keyframes to wherever I would like. I can also, if I liked, hold Shift, select both keyframes, hold Alt and stretch the time out or shrink the time from which the transform happens in. Move that one back. I can also Command C, so copy. So I've got keyframe 1 selected, I know that because it's in blue. Move the slider to the end and select Command V to paste. I can even copy and paste my keyframes. It's going to rewind back. Or I can simply also delete them with backspace. Now I can have as many keyframes as I like on this timeline. But this animation is very simple, so I'm just going to keep it to 2. So we've done the foreground. Now we're going to do the midground. You might have noticed the foreground layer is much bigger than the midground layer. That's so that it has more information to run through between position A and B within 5 seconds, so it will look like it's going faster. As we go further afield back, we're going to go slower and slower and find each layer is smaller. And that's what happens when you're like sat in the car or on a train looking out the window. And that's how we're going to build a depth of field. So midground, to paste that first keyframe in, I'm going to hit the stopwatch with the time slider at the beginning. Move the slider to the end. However, this time I'm not going to pick up the layer and move it. I'm going to actually select the value, the X value. I'm going to hold down my click and just pull that value along. I'm doing it this way because I know that A, I'm going to have a perfect straight line, and B, just to show you another way you can animate. So now I've got 2 keyframes and that layer should move slower than the layer in front. Great. Pardon me. And then finally, I'm just going to repeat that one last time for the background. So time slider to the beginning, position stopwatch keyframe on, move the slider. Oh, no, don't want my Y, I want my X. And move that back layer to the end. Now let's say I didn't like the keyframes I'd set for this back layer. So the only other time I'm going to select my stopwatch today is to activate and deactivate keyframes. So if I select it again, as you can see, it's voided off those keyframes. I'm just going to Command Z to bring them back. There we go. So got 3 layers moving nicely in succinct. And let's just prove that we can animate that sheep separate to the mid-ground animation. So I'm going to select position, place a stopwatch, and about 4 seconds in, I'd like it to have walked maybe about here. Now this time I might need to zoom in closer, going to use my Bezier curve just to get the sheep to look like it's coming over slightly. And actually, maybe to the side more. Great. Super. Now, I've also noticed I've got a little bit of white next to my sheep's legs. If I was to go back to my Photoshop file, erase those, save it and come back into After Effects, I'll find that it will have automatically made that change for me. However, what I can't do is add more sheep as new layers. I'll have to add them as JPEGs to my project panel. But yeah, so that is simple keyframing. If you want to export this project out, just jump ahead to the export video. And if you want to carry on and start looking at character walk cycles and more complex keyframing, then watch the next video. Thanks everyone.